Welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this nice interview. Now, as Ukraine sent a delegation to Washington for pivotal talks on a prospective peace plan, a series of rapid developments raise urgent questions. Major missile strike on the capital and sudden political reshuffle in Kyiv point to raising urgency, as well as international and internal tensions within Ukraine's wartime leadership. Joining us today on TVP World to unpack these developments is Scott Lucas, professor of international politics and founder of EA Worldview, whose expertise in U.S. foreign policy as well as conflict diplomacy offers us insight into Ukraine's fragile moment of transition. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thanks to you, and thanks to all your great viewers.
Now, just moments ago, we've heard that the Ukrainian delegation has finally wrapped up a 4-hour-long conversation. And according to the Ukrainian side, they describe it as difficult. Meanwhile, Marco Rubio has called this a productive conversation while also acknowledging that there has been difficult sticking points. What do you gather from the conclusion of some of these statements?
Well, I think taking interest in both the American and the Ukrainian statements, both sides are referring to productive talks or constructive talks. So it was good that they are meeting in Florida. But at the same time, they are referring to complicated talks. In other words, there is no easy remedy to end Russia's, what is now a 46-month full-scale invasion. We know that because the issues themselves are quite complex in terms of Russia's occupation of about 19% of Ukraine and its desire to seize even more territory, the questions of Russia's ongoing aerial attacks that you have just referred to on Ukraine, with an unwillingness to pull those back, the economic issues, whether you're talking about the sanctions on Moscow, whether you're talking about the issues of Ukraine's reconstruction. And I think the fundamental here is that we don't have just one Trump group. We've got two different Trump groups here. We have one, and importantly, that one faction that wants to work with Ukraine is led by U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who is at the talks in Florida. But the other faction in the Trump administration, which is pro-Kremlin, and we need to recognize they're pro-Kremlin, led by the Trump envoy Steve Witkoff, you can't just simply assume that they'll accept whatever comes out of today's talks, especially with Witkoff going to Moscow later this week.
Right. Speaking of Witkoff's trip to Moscow, Rubio here also mentioned that there's going to be a conversation with the Russian side soon, even though they pretty much already know what their stance of things are. At this point, what do you think would happen? And is there anything on the Russian side that they still have leverage when it comes to this negotiation and could potentially still sway the outcome of some of the discussion that is being had today?
Well, I mean, let's say, first of all, the Trump administration has leverage if they want to use it. I mean, and we saw them use some of that leverage with the sanctions on Russia's leading oil companies that came into effect just this month and that are already sharply affecting Russian oil revenues. We know that if the Trump administration wanted to have more leverage, they could give Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine for strikes inside Russia, something that one faction within the administration favors. So they have leverage. But again, and you see him on screen there, Steve Witkoff, and indeed Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, they have no interest in leverage on Russia. They have no interest in extending the sanctions further. Instead, they are, and we know this now from detailed leaks, they're talking about striking lucrative economic deals with the Russians. We know that Witkoff has no interest in the Tomahawks going to Ukraine. Indeed, he not only argued against it last month, he colluded with the Russians to get Vladimir Putin to call Donald Trump so that the Tomahawks would not be delivered. So this is the fundamental, that you have one part of the Trump administration that wants to defend Ukraine, but you have the other side supporting Vladimir Putin, even though we know that the starting point, not the end point, the starting point for Putin is he must get more Ukrainian territory. He must get the rest of that Donetsk region, even though Ukraine holds about 22% of it. And until the Trump administration draws a firm line with Putin, you will not get additional territory. Ukraine will not withdraw from territory. We're going to have this conflicting U.S. position. And the best that Ukraine can do with its European partners supporting it is to limit that conflicting U.S. position by working with Rubio to contain the damage and by maintaining the U.S. support where it does come. Intelligence sharing, sales of U.S. military equipment through NATO allies to Ukraine, and U.S. support for economic and financial help that's coming from others, such as the international community and from the Europeans.
Right. One of the biggest sticking point, of course, that we've been talking about since perhaps the beginning of the war is actually that on ceding territory as well as security guarantees. And it doesn't really seem like there's an easy solution to this. Now, while these conversations are being described as productive and constructive, do you think that there's any sort of give and take and anything that could potentially shift this kind of sticking point, that the hurdle that just can't seem to be crossed?
I mean, I'll just tell you as an analyst, there's a clear, if not easy solution, and that is, and I'll repeat it, I said it a moment ago, you draw the line with Moscow and say the starting point here is that you have a ceasefire on the basis of the current front lines. And indeed, even though Donald Trump had a difficult meeting with Vladimir Zelensky, the Ukrainian prime minister, last month, even though Steve Witkoff was in that room calling for Donetsk to be given to the Russians, at the end of that meeting, Donald Trump said ceasefire on the basis of the current front lines. The problem is that Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, backed, I suspect, by the U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, undercut that solution by negotiating with the Russians. Vladimir Putin's chief economic advisor, Kirill Dmitriev, his foreign policy aide, Yuri Ushakov, they colluded with the Russians in the next few weeks after that October meeting. And they colluded with them on this plan, which was a Russian plan to start with, although it was presented as Trump's plan, which said Ukraine has to give up territory. So if you want to get back to the solution, you get back to the line of saying ceasefire first, then we discuss the issues. And it starts from the basis of the current front lines rather than conceding territory to Russia. And it starts from the basis of that there is not a ban on Western military support for Ukraine. There are no strict limits on military support for Ukraine because that military support has to be part of security guarantees in a resolution of this conflict.
All right, I would like to touch upon the leaks that you were talking about, reported by the Wall Street Journal, that essentially there's been some backchannel deals between Witkoff, Jared Kushner on the Russian side of things. How much shift do you think that this, or how much damage do you think that this might cause the negotiation process when it comes to Ukraine?
You cannot have a constructive negotiating process with Ukraine when you have certain Trump officials who are working with Russia as the Kremlin maintains maximum demands. And I need to back that up. That's a provocative statement. So let me go back to what we've learned in the past few days. In April, the Kremlin, through Kirill Dmitriev, this key economic advisor who's been working with the Trump administration since at least the start of 2017, proposed joint economic projects involving U.S. and Russian companies. These were projects in the energy sector. These were projects over rare earth minerals. These were projects in other areas of investment and development. Those proposals were tabled just before Steve Witkoff went to St. Petersburg and then Moscow in April of this year. Now, even though others within the Trump administration kept the focus on supporting Ukraine, when we get to October, and when Steve Witkoff wants to make sure that the Tomahawks are not given to Ukraine, and when he wants to try to limit the U.S. sanctions on Ukraine, he and Kirill Dmitriev go back to those joint economic projects. And it's not just Witkoff. It's not just Jared Kushner. U.S. companies have been working with or in discussions with Russians about these projects. For example, ExxonMobil's top officials have met with the top officials of Russia's largest state energy firm, Rosneft. Largest state private firm, I should say, Rosneft. We know that certain Trump donors who are businessmen have been in specific discussions with Russians, including members of Putin's inner circle, about projects. So the problem here is that the security issue, the issue of Ukraine's resistance against the invasion, has been overtaken by some Trump officials for the search for economic profits working with the Russians. And until you get rid of that priority, until you pull Witkoff and Kushner back, this fundamental conflict is going to remain.
Right. Now, there's also another aspect I want to tackle. We've recently seen a little bit of a reshuffle within the Ukrainian government. How much impact do you think that will have when it comes to these negotiations?
Well, I think the first thing you need to talk about is the impact on the Ukrainian people and on Ukrainian support for the resistance to the invasion. Because when you talk about Ukrainians who have sacrificed their loved ones, who have lost family and friends on the front line or from the Russian aerial attacks, when you talk about the millions of Ukrainians who have lost their homes, either fleeing the country or being displaced within it, they see all this sacrifice takes place, and then they see some of the top figures in Ukraine implicated in this corruption scandal involving $100 million in kickbacks around the nuclear energy industry. You're showing one of those folks right now, Andrei Yermak, the former presidential chief of staff, who finally had to resign a couple of days ago after it was confirmed that he was being investigated and his premises raided by anti-corruption agencies. You have seen it involve the former energy minister, who was later justice minister, Mr. Halashenko. You've seen it in terms of a former deputy prime minister, and you've seen it in Vladimir Zelensky's former business partner and close friend, Timur Mendich. All of these people are involved in this scheme, which is taking money away from the energy industry as Russia is attacking it from the air and causing massive power outages. So you have to show responsibility as a government to your own people first, and then to the international community, who say, if we keep supporting you with hundreds of billions of dollars, we need to know that they're being used and not siphoned away in corruption. And so, yes, I have said privately, and folks know that Yermak needed to go. He needed to go for months. He was probably involved in trying to shut down Ukraine's anti-corruption agencies this summer. Well, Yermak finally is gone. And the former energy minister finally is gone. And there are replacements who are being named. And you have to hope that these replacements are above board. They are not corrupt. They are not implicated in this scandal. And they are responsible first and foremost for Ukraine's survival rather than lining their own pockets. That is a starting point, let alone one that has to be reached as you continue the resistance.
All right. Last but not least, looking forward to these negotiations, what are some of the best case scenario that could potentially emerge from these talks? And do you think that there's still a path for a favorable outcome for Ukraine?
There is always a path to an outcome for Ukraine. I mean, the fact of the matter is, I come back to here, Ukraine still stands. Every effort by the Russians to break Ukraine in 46 months has not yet succeeded, despite the fact that you have some people in the Trump administration complicit with it. What do you need? You need to start from the point, first of all, that you're not going to reach a ceasefire in the near future because of one person, and that's Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin is not interested in a ceasefire. He's interested in gaining more territory. He's interested in getting the sanctions lifted. So what do you have to do? You have to maintain your conditions. And your conditions are this, that we want there to be a ceasefire. We will negotiate on the basis of obtaining a ceasefire. But to get there, we have to make sure that Ukraine is not forced into a position of surrender. That means that the European and international support, and it's not just Europe backing Ukraine, it's many countries around the world, has to continue. That, I think, has to include economic and financial as well as military aid. You have to continue to have a line to the adults in the room in the Trump administration. And right now, that's the Marco Rubio faction.
Right.
That they do not capitulate to Russia's demands, and you hold that line for as long as necessary.
Thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate that. And thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Thanks to you and all your viewers.
Cheers. And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. For more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.